Dad, you're not getting a dime. Those words cut through the polished air of the law office like a blade. For a moment, even the hum of the heater seemed to fall silent. My eldest son, Richard, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that carried the weight of years, where he thought he had finally outgrown me, surpassed me, maybe even buried me in his rearview mirror. His voice, sharp and steady, echoed against the walnut-paneled walls as though he wanted every cousin, every aunt, every wide-eyed relative in that room to remember this moment. The day Richard Miller announced his father was finished, I didn't answer him. I didn't need to dot before we continue. Please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The winter rain tapped against the tall windows of Anderson and Clark, a rhythm as steady as my own heartbeat. Seattle winters always seemed to seep into your bones, cold gray, unrelenting. The kind of chill that made a man reflect on what he'd lost and what he still had left. Margaret used to say, Seattle weather made people either poets or drunks. I suppose I became a little of both after she passed. I folded my hands in my lap and studied my children. Richard sat with his wife Catherine by his side. She looked like she'd dressed for a photo shoot, all sleek lines and a diamond bracelet that caught the office lights just so. Her hand rested lightly on Richard's arm, almost like a leash. He drew strength from her presence, but I could see how tightly her nails pressed into his sleeve when she thought no one was watching. Emily sat across the room, arms crossed, lips pursed into that tight expression I'd seen since she was 16 and determined to have the last word at every dinner table. She had her husband waiting out in the hallway with their 2 kids, as if this whole reading of her mother's will was just another errand on a Saturday afternoon. David, my youngest, stayed near the window. He didn't speak. He hardly ever did when family matters turned ugly. His shoulders sloped forward and he fiddled with the cuff of his jacket, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. There was still something soft in him. Something that hadn't hardened all the way yet. But soft things get crushed easily in this family. And then there was me, 74 years old. The widower of Margaret Miller, sitting in the same chair where we had once signed our mortgage papers 3 decades earlier. I remembered the smell of her perfume that day, faint lavender mixing with the sharp tang of fresh printed contracts. She had smiled at me over the table, whispering, "Jacob, this is the start of everything we'll build together." Now she was gone and I was left with a family that seemed to think her death was their lottery ticket. The room itself carried that lawyer's aura, rows of law books, brass lamp on the desk, the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. Charles Anderson, our attorney, and Margaret's longtime friend sat quietly at the head of the table. His hair had gone white since the last time I'd seen him, but his eyes still had that courtroom sharpness. He shuffled the papers before him, his hands steady. I wondered if he already knew what storm was about to break. The relatives crowded along the sides of the room, Linda, my sister-in-law, whispering into Mark's ear, Susan leaning forward with greedy eyes. They smelled blood in the water, and they couldn't wait to see who would come out feeding. Richard's words lingered in the air. He wanted them to. He wanted to humiliate me, to make me small before the will was even read. I thought of Margaret again. The last night in the hospital, machines humming softly in the background, her hand frail in mine. Her voice, worn thin but still determined, had carried a weight I could never ignore. "Jacob, promise me," she had whispered. "Promise me you'll keep your dignity. Promise me you won't let them forget who their father is." I had promised. So I stayed silent now because silence can be louder than rage. Charles cleared his throat, the sound measured. "If we could proceed," he said, glancing at Richard as though he were scolding a child. But Richard only leaned back further, spreading his legs like a man at ease in his throne. Catherine's smile sharpened. Emily rolled her eyes. David kept watching the rain. I studied Richard, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be. 8 years old, clutching a Little League bat, looking at me with wide eyes after his first strikeout. "Dad, I'm no good," he'd muttered. I had knelt down, wiped his tears, and told him, "You don't quit just because you stumble. You keep swinging until you find your strength." Now here he was, 44 years old, convinced his strength was measured in dollar, signs, and inheritance. I wondered where I had lost him, or if he had lost himself. Emily caught my gaze and quickly looked away. She didn't hate me, not really, but she let Richard lead the way she always had. He had that pull, that big brother gravity she could never resist. And David, sweet David. He finally looked at me just for a moment and our eyes locked. There was apology there, maybe even shame. Then he turned back to the window. Charles shuffled the will. The sound of paper sliding against paper filled the silence. The relatives leaned in eager. My children tensed in different ways, Richard with arrogance, Emily with impatience, David with quiet dread. And me, I sat there remembering Margaret's face, her words, and the vow that had burned into my chest like a brand. Whatever was written on those papers, whatever storm Richard thought he had unleashed, I knew one thing: I would not be erased. Richard shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and gave me that look he had perfected over the years, the look that said he was the one in control now. I had seen it in business meetings he dragged me to when he was younger, when he wanted me to co-sign a loan or write a check to bail him out of yet another mess. He wore that same expression now, except this time he thought the power was permanent. "You should have stayed home, Dad," he muttered low enough for just me and Catherine to hear. "This is our moment, not yours." Catherine's smile spread wider, her teeth glinting in the soft office light. She leaned close to whisper in his ear, but her words were pitched just loud enough to carry across the table. "Richard, don't waste your breath. He knows it's over." I let my eyes rest on her, steady and calm. Catherine had always reminded me of a cold draft sneaking under a door, subtle at first but relentless once it seeped in. She had been pushing Richard for years, feeding his ego, stoking his resentment toward me. A woman like her didn't build a fire. She poured gasoline and waited for the spark. Emily finally broke the silence with a sharp exhale. "Can we get this over with? Some of us have things to do today." She pulled her phone out, tapped the screen, and sighed loudly, as if being here was an inconvenience instead of the reading of her own mother's will. I watched her, remembering the night she left for college, suitcase in hand, her eyes flashing with determination. Margaret had cried on the porch that night, but I had told her, "Let her go. She'll find her way back when she knows what home really means." But home to Emily had become boardrooms and country clubs, places where I was an embarrassment, a reminder of roots she'd rather forget. David shifted near the window, his reflection hazy against the glass. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said softly, "We don't have to do this like it's a circus." His voice was almost swallowed by the rain, but I caught it. And so did Richard. "Grow a spine," David Richard snapped. "This isn't a circus, it's business, and Dad doesn't belong in it anymore." Charles cleared his throat again, louder, this time his patience thinning. "I would remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding, not a family argument. If we cannot maintain decorum, I will have to pause until we can." The room stilled, but the air was still thick with tension. Linda whispered something to Susan, and they both stifled laughs. Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly enjoying the spectacle, but not brave enough to add his voice. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the wood press into my spine. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could. It was Margaret's trick, really. She used to tell me, "Jacob, sometimes the loudest hammer is the one you never swing." I thought of her again, the way her hair fell around her face as she sat at our kitchen table, balancing the checkbook, her insistence that every dollar had a purpose, every sacrifice meant something. She believed in building slowly and saving for storms. It was her discipline that turned a modest life into a fortune neither of us ever bragged about. And now I sat in this room listening to our children treat it like a prize to be claimed. "Dad looks smug," Richard announced, suddenly narrowing his eyes at me. "You think this is funny, don't you? Sitting there like you've got some secret up your sleeve?" I didn't answer. Charles set the papers down, his palm resting flat on the will as if to keep it from flying away in the storm of words. "We will proceed in a moment," he said, his gaze moving from Richard to Emily, then back to me. "But before we do, I want everyone to understand something." Margaret left instructions, clear instructions that must be followed exactly. The relatives leaned forward as one curiosity sharpening like blades. Even Emily put her phone down. David pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging a small circle. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Instructions, please. Mom knew what she wanted, and she wanted me to take the lead. Everyone knows that." Catherine nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Margaret trusted Richard. She told us so. but I caught the flicker in Charles's eyes, the way he lingered on me for just a second too long. Margaret had been his friend as much as mine. They'd shared Sunday coffee after church, traded recipes, laughed about how stubborn I could be. If anyone understood her mind, it was Charles. I breathed deeply, the scent of old books and polished wood filling my lungs. Margaret's voice whispered again in memory. "Don't let them take away your dignity, Jacob. That's worth more than all the money in the world." The moment Charles set the papers down and reminded us of Margaret's clear instructions, the murmurs began to ripple. At first, it was just a whisper between Linda and Susan, but soon the whole side of the room where my relatives sat buzzed like a hive. I didn't need to strain my ears. They wanted me to hear. Jacob never could manage money on his own. Linda hissed, pretending to cover her mouth. It was always Margaret who made the smart choices. Susan chuckled under her breath. And now he thinks he's entitled to sit here like he's still the head of this family. Mark, never one to miss a chance at sarcasm, added, "Maybe he'll finally have to sell that old house of his." Shame, though. It's the only thing he's got left. The sting of their words was sharper than the winter air outside, but I sat steady. I'd weathered worse storms, and I wasn't about to let a few whispers break me down. Still inside, their cruelty pressed against old scars that had never fully healed. Richard, emboldened by the laughter, leaned forward and grinned at them as though he were already the victor of the night. Emily smirked faintly, though I noticed she wouldn't quite look me in the eye. David stayed in his corner, shifting uncomfortably, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. I couldn't stop the memories that crept in, uninvited but persistent. I thought back to a night nearly 20 years ago when Richard's business venture had collapsed. He came to me, shoulders slumped, voice shaky. "Dad, I just need one more chance. Just a little help to get back on my feet." I'd pulled from my retirement savings, cutting into funds Margaret and I had set aside for our later years, and handed it over without hesitation. "Don't waste this, son," I'd said. He had promised he wouldn't, not long after I was writing another check, and another. Emily had been no different in her own way. When she wanted to attend that private university back east, Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table night after night poring over numbers. We cut corners, sold the second car, and I even took extra shifts at the plant. She graduated without debt, her diploma framed proudly in our living room. Yet here she was, arms crossed, treating me like a burden she'd rather ignore. And David, sweet, quiet David. He had struggled in school, and it was me who spent late nights at the dining room table with him, sounding out words, drawing diagrams, finding patience I didn't know I had. I'd defended him when Richard called him weak, when Emily called him spoiled. I had always thought David would remember. Maybe he did deep down. But looking at them now, it felt as though every sacrifice had been washed away with Margaret's last breath. The whispers grew louder. "Linda, again, maybe Jacob should be in a nursing home instead of here wasting our time." I clenched my jaw, the words striking like a hammer. A nursing home, the very thing Margaret had feared most for me. We had talked about it during her last weeks, the idea of being pushed aside, of being stripped of choice. "Promise me, Jacob," she had said, her eyes fierce, even as her body failed. "Don't let them shove you into some corner of the world where you're forgotten." I had promised her that too. A cough behind me broke the tension. Reverend Paul had come in quietly, slipping into the back of the room with the kind of presence only a preacher could carry, gentle but impossible to ignore. He gave me a nod, one of those nods that said, "I'm here if you need me." Mrs. Thompson, my neighbor of 20 years, had also come along for support. She sat near the back, clutching her handbag tightly, lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Richard with clear disapproval. "Your Margaret was a saint," she had told me earlier that week at the grocery store. "Don't you let them trample on what the two of you built." Her words lingered with me now, giving me just enough strength to keep sitting upright. I could feel the tide of the room turning into open mockery, but Charles lifted his hand palm flat against the oak table. His voice was firm, measured. "Before we proceed, there is something else." That silenced them, at least for a moment. The whispers stopped, the laughter caught in throats. All eyes swung back to him and then slowly to me. The storm was gathering, and none of them knew what was coming. Charles's voice carried a weight that immediately commanded the room. Even Richard leaned back slightly, suspicion clouding his smirk. "There are provisions here," Charles said slowly, "that cannot be rushed." Margaret took careful steps to ensure her wishes were respected. She anticipated conflict. His eyes moved deliberately from Richard to Emily, then settled on me for a long moment before he returned to the papers in front of him. The silence that followed was uneasy. I could almost hear the tick of that brass clock above Charles's desk. Every second seemed to echo. Richard finally broke it with a scoff. "Conflict, please." "The only conflict is Dad refusing to admit he's done. Mom trusted me to handle things. Everyone knows I've got the head for it." He tapped a finger on the table as if he were already signing the checks. Catherine gave a little laugh. "Jacob, you should feel relieved. Richard will take good care of things. Better than you ever could." My jaw tightened, but I stayed silent. Then Emily, for the first time, spoke up with more edge in her voice. "Honestly, Dad, Mom was always the one who managed everything. It just makes sense for Richard to step in. You don't have to make this difficult." Her words stung sharper because they carried a kernel of truth. Margaret had been steady, meticulous. She balanced our checkbook with the precision of a banker, clipped coupons even when we didn't need to, and planned for futures none of us could see yet. But I'd been there too, working overtime shifts, patching the roof when it leaked, teaching the kids that our word meant more than our wealth. The tension in that room didn't fade after Charles's warning. If anything, it grew sharper, like a blade pressed just under the skin. I could feel Richard's eyes drilling into me, Catherine's hand clutching his arm like a tether, Emily biting her lip as though weighing her loyalties, and David shifting his weight with that restless guilt of his. Charles shuffled the papers once more, his movements deliberate. "We will come back to Margaret's sealed instructions at the appropriate time," he said, his tone steady, the kind of calm that hinted at storms just beyond the horizon. I leaned back, pretending to be more tired than I was. In truth, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Margaret had left more than money behind. She had left the plan. I could feel it in my bones. Richard, impatient as ever, broke the silence first. "This is ridiculous. Everyone knows what Mom wanted. She told me herself more than once." Catherine leaned toward him, her voice just low enough to pass for support but loud enough to sting me. "You have to take control of this before he twists it. If you don't, Richard, you'll lose everything. And don't forget, the bank isn't going to wait much longer." Her words froze me. A debt. So that was it. Richard's arrogance wasn't just greed, it was desperation. I watched his jaw tighten, his knuckles pale as he gripped the armrest. He didn't deny her words, and that silence was as telling as any confession. Emily sat straighter, glancing between her brother and me. "She's right, Richard. Mom wanted you to lead. Dad doesn't need this kind of stress, not at his age. We could all benefit if you just step in now before things get messy." Her voice carried an edge of conviction, but beneath it I heard something else, fear maybe, or the comfort of choosing the side that seemed stronger. I'd seen it before when she was a girl, clinging to Richard's shadow in every family argument. It was easier to follow the loudest voice. David finally spoke, his words quieter, but firmer than before. "Emily, you don't know that. None of us do. You're all talking like Dad isn't even here, like he doesn't matter." His voice cracked slightly, but his eyes stayed on her. Emily frowned, her tone sharper. "David, don't be naive. Mom trusted Richard. It's not about Dad not mattering, it's about what's practical. Do you really think Dad can handle $20 million at his age?" Her words landed hard, but David didn't look away. "I think Dad has handled more than any of us realize. Maybe we should stop acting like children fighting over candy and listen to him for once." The room quieted for a moment, just long enough for the rain outside to fill the silence. I wanted to thank David, but I knew better than to speak too soon. Let them argue. Let them reveal themselves. As they squabbled, my mind wandered back, carried by Margaret's memory. I remembered our first home, a sagging little place on the edge of Tacoma. The roof leaked, the furnace rattled, and the walls were so thin we could hear the neighbors argue at night. We didn't have much, but Margaret had made it a home with little more than elbow grease and faith. She used to say, "Jacob, it's not the walls that matter. It's the life we build inside them." We saved every dollar patch by patch, never living beyond our means. I worked double shifts at the plant. My hands cracked and raw, while she stretched every penny into meals that somehow fed us all. That's how we built what we had. Sweat, sacrifice, and a kind of love that wasn't flashy but held us together like mortar between bricks. And now our children sat in this polished office, speaking as though they'd earned it. Charles cleared his throat again, this time with purpose. He reached for a separate folder from the pile, its edges sealed in a deep red envelope I hadn't noticed before. My heart skipped. The room hushed instantly. Richard's smirk faltered. Emily's arms dropped from her chest. Even Catherine leaned in, eyes narrowing with curiosity. David looked at me, his expression unreadable. Charles placed the envelope on the table, his fingers resting on it as though it carried more weight than any other paper there. This, he said quietly, is to be read only under very specific conditions. Margaret was clear about that. Until those conditions are met, it stays sealed. The air thickened the kind of silence that prickled the back of your neck. And in that moment, I realized Margaret's hand was still guiding this family even from beyond the grave. The sight of that red envelope sitting on the table burned into my vision. For a moment, I forgot the whispers, the insults, even Richard's smug face. All I could think about was Margaret. Her hands folding laundry in the old house, her quiet laughter as she clipped coupons at the kitchen counter, the way she had looked at me with steady faith even when we had nothing. She had planned for this. Somehow she had seen through all the cracks in our children's hearts and left a safeguard. Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp. What conditions? Why can't we just open it now? Charles didn't flinch. Because Margaret was explicit. This envelope is not to be opened unless Jacob is present and able to hear it himself. Until then, it remains sealed. The words hung in the air, and I felt the eyes of everyone swing to me. Richard laughed bitterly, though his laughter rang hollow. So what? He sits here in silence, and suddenly that qualifies. This is absurd. Catherine squeezed his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I saw the tension in her jaw. She was worried, though she tried to hide it behind that practiced smile. Emily shifted in her seat, her brow furrowing. If Mom went to all this trouble, maybe we should respect it. Her voice was uncertain, and for the first time all evening, she wasn't parroting Richard's confidence. That flicker of doubt lit a fire in Richard. He slammed his hand on the table, startling half the room. No, you don't understand. This was supposed to be simple. Mom wanted me to take over. Dad's just sitting there pretending he knows something we don't. David's voice cut in softer but steadier. Maybe he does. The room went still again. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Margaret had always told me my silence would one day speak louder than any argument. Tonight I felt that truth settling over the room like a heavy quilt. The storm outside pounded against the glass as if it were demanding entry, rattling the tall windows of the office. Inside, the silence was so heavy it pressed down on all of us. Every breath felt amplified. Every glance cut deeper than words. Charles adjusted his glasses, his hands steady, though I noticed a flicker of emotion in his eyes. He understood the weight of this moment. The red envelope sat before him, its wax seal unbroken, a quiet sentinel between me and the children I had once held on my shoulders. He cleared his throat, then spoke slowly. Margaret left this as a supplement to her will. She wanted it read only when Jacob was present, able to hear it in his own right. Richard shifted impatiently, muttering, "Just get on with it." Catherine leaned toward him, whispering fiercely, her diamond bracelet clinking against the polished table. Emily clasped her hands tightly in her lap while David's eyes darted between me and the envelope, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line. Charles broke the seal, the sound sharp as thunder in the still room. He unfolded the pages inside, smoothing them with deliberate care. His voice carried clear and steady, yet to me every word struck like the ringing of a church bell. To my beloved husband, Jacob, Charles read, "You have been my partner in every trial and triumph. You stood beside me when we had little, and you never wavered when we built our life from nothing. I leave to you the full guardianship of our estate, totaling $20 million, with the authority to determine how it is to be used." The room gasped as one. I heard the sharp inhale of my relatives, the scrape of Richard's chair as he leaned forward, the sound of Emily's nails tapping nervously against the armrest. Charles continued, his voice firm. "To our children, hear these words. I entrust everything to your father, not because I doubt you, but because I know the heart of the man I chose. If you are ungrateful, if you forget the meaning of family and respect, then Jacob will decide what is fair. His judgment will be final. My breath caught. Even though I had suspected Margaret had left me something beyond the will, I hadn't expected this. Her words poured through me like warm light, steadying me, in a way I hadn't felt since the day she left this world. Richard shot to his feet, his face blotched red. "This is outrageous. She would never. This is manipulated. You." He pointed at me, finger trembling. "You made her write this." Catherine tugged at his sleeve, her voice sharp, hissing in his ear. "Calm down. Don't make a scene. We can contest this." But her eyes betrayed her. Fear, panic, the kind that comes when the ground shifts beneath your feet. Emily sat frozen, lips parted, eyes wide, as if she had been struck. She looked at me, searching for something, but her words failed her. David's face was pale, but he didn't look away. He just stared at me then, at the letter, as if trying to reconcile the image of his mother with the truth laid bare before him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm outside seemed to quiet, leaving only the sound of the old clock ticking on the wall. I lifted my eyes from the paper to the room full of faces, some furious, some shaken, some hollow, and then I let the faintest smile cross my lips. "So this is what you all were waiting for," I said softly. The words hung there steady and unyielding, cutting through the tension like a blade. The silence that followed my words was thick enough to choke on. I watched Richard's face twist, or his jaw clenching so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. Catherine leaned closer to him, whispering furiously, but her whispers couldn't mask the way her fingers trembled against his sleeve. "You think this changes anything?" Richard spat finally, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You're too old to handle this. You'll mess it up, and when you do, the bank will be there waiting." "You don't understand how the world works anymore, Dad." I held his gaze steady as stone. "I understand more than you think. Your mother and I built everything you see without shortcuts, without lies. Maybe that's the part you forgot." Emily shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me and her brother. Her face was pale, her confidence cracked. "Richard, maybe we should slow down. If this is what Mom wanted, don't you dare." Richard snapped, cutting her off with a glare that could have sliced glass. "You're going soft. He's manipulating you." But the way Emily's shoulders sank told me the seeds of doubt had already taken root. David spoke quietly, almost to himself, but the room carried his words. "Mom trusted Dad, that's clear. Maybe we should too." For once, no one interrupted him. His words settled over the room like a faint but steady drumbeat. Catherine finally broke the pause, her voice sharp, rehearsed. "We can contest this. Wills can be challenged, and judges don't just hand out power without oversight. Jacob, you can't possibly think you'll be able to manage this without assistance." Her eyes narrowed on me, the word assistance laced with venom. She wasn't offering help. She was threatening control. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table. My voice was calm, but it cut through her words like steel. "Your mother gave me authority because she knew this moment would come. She knew who would show respect and who would bare their teeth." I let my eyes linger on Richard, then Catherine, before returning to Charles. "And now we all know too?" The air shifted again, heavy with the weight of truth laid bare. Charles closed the folder slowly, the red envelope tucked back inside. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second I thought I saw relief there, as though he had been waiting for me to rise to the moment. Richard's fists tightened on the table, his breath shallow and uneven. He wanted to lash out, to shout, to overturn the table if it meant regaining control. But the more he fought, the more the ground crumbled beneath him. I sat back, letting the storm rage inside my children's eyes. For the first time that night, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. And Margaret's words still echoed in my chest, steady and sure. If they are ungrateful, Jacob will decide. His judgment will be final. I lifted my chin, the faint smile still on my lips. "This is just the beginning," I said softly, letting the words hang. When the meeting finally broke, the rain outside had slowed to a steady drizzle, but inside the walls of Anderson and Clark, the storm lingered in every face that passed me. Richard stormed out first, Catherine, close behind her heels, clacking against the tile. I caught a sharp whisper as they passed, her voice urgent and low. "We'll call Markson in the morning. If we contest this, the court won't let him hold all the cards," Richard muttered back, too angry to care who overheard. "I don't care what it takes. I won't let him ruin me." Emily lingered longer, her hands trembling as she pulled on her coat. For the first time all evening, she looked at me not with scorn, but with something softer. Hesitation, maybe. Regret. But she said nothing. She simply lowered her gaze and followed her brother into the wet night. David stood by the window for a long moment after everyone else had gone, his reflection blurred by the mist on the glass. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His shoulders sagged. With a quiet nod in my direction, he slipped out, leaving me alone with Charles and the echo of Margaret's voice still ringing in my ears. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt colder without Margaret in it, emptier still with the storm of betrayal hanging overhead. I sat in my recliner with the old lamp, casting a weak glow, staring at the framed photos on the mantel. Margaret holding the kids at the county fair. Emily's college graduation. Richard on the baseball field, beaming after his first win. David's toothless grin when he caught his first fish with me at the lake. Each picture felt like a lie, now a reminder of how far we had drifted from those moments. The next morning I walked to the church early. Reverend Paul was in his office, the smell of coffee and old wood filling the air. He looked up as I entered, concern etching his face before I even spoke. "Jacob," he said softly, "I heard there was trouble last night." I sank into the chair across from him, my hands heavy on my knees. "Trouble doesn't begin to cover it. Paul, I thought I'd lost Margaret once when she passed, but last night I lost her again and our children." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but steady. "Betrayal from your own flesh, and blood cuts deeper than any other wound. But Jacob, Margaret trusted you for a reason. She saw something in you that no court, no lawyer, no greedy hand can take away." I rubbed my eyes, the weight pressing harder. Richard's already planning to fight me in court. Catherine's whispering poison in his ear. Emily, I don't know. She looked at me different last night, but she's still standing behind him. And David, he wants to say something, I can feel it, but he's afraid. Paul nodded. Give them time. Truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. His words stayed with me as I walked home, the air damp and heavy with the smell of rain. For a moment, I almost believed him. But by evening, reality crashed back. A neighbor dropped off the latest paper, shaking her head as she handed it to me. There, on the front page of the Seattle Times, bold letters screamed $20 million Will Sparks family battle. And beneath it, a photo of me leaving Anderson and Clark, caught in the flash of a camera I hadn't even noticed. The morning after the article broke, I walked into the diner where I'd had coffee for 20 years. The bell above the door jingled the same way it always did, but the eyes that turned toward me felt different. Too many lingered. Conversation slowed just enough to let me know I was the subject. I slid into my usual booth by the window. Linda, the waitress, who'd served me 1,000 cups of coffee, poured one without my asking. But she didn't meet my eyes the way she used to. Her smile was quick-forced, like she was caught between habit and hesitation. "Rough week, huh, Jacob?" she said, setting the mug down. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. You could say that. Before I could take a sip, 2 men at the counter started talking louder, making sure I heard. 20 million, and the old man thinks he can keep it all, one muttered. Yeah, the other replied, shaking his head. Word is he's not all there anymore. Forgetful, confused. Richard says he's been slipping for years. My chest tightened, though I didn't let my face show it. Richard's lies had already spread faster than wildfire in a dry summer. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and stared out at the rain-streaked street. By afternoon, Reverend Paul stopped by my house. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes heavy with concern. "Jacob," he began, "I've heard some troubling talk. Richard's telling people you're not capable of managing your affairs. He's planning to petition for conservatorship." The word hit me like a hammer. Conservatorship. The very thing Margaret had feared, being stripped of choice, treated like a burden to be managed. "He's saying I've lost my mind." My voice was low, steady, though I could feel the heat rising in my chest. Paul nodded grimly. "He's convincing. Catherine's been rallying the relatives, getting them to sign statements. They say you're forgetful, that you wander, that you repeat yourself." I clenched my fists. Yes, I misplaced my glasses now and then. I mixed up names sometimes. But I was no invalid. Margaret had known that. That's why she'd trusted me above all. "People believe what they want to believe," Paul said gently. "And money has a way of tilting truth." That night I went to the potluck at the church basement as I always had. The smell of casseroles and baked beans hung in the air, but the warmth I once felt was gone. Conversations hushed when I walked past. Some offered polite nods, others avoided me entirely. At one table, I overheard a familiar voice, Martha, who had known Margaret for 30 years. "It's a shame," she whispered, not realizing I stood behind her. "I just don't think Jacob's strong enough for this kind of responsibility anymore." I stepped away before she saw me carrying my plate of food to a corner table, alone. Emily came late, her coat damp from the rain. She spotted me and froze, torn between joining her cousins or sitting with me. For a long moment her eyes searched mine, heavy with guilt. Then hesitantly, she walked toward me. "Dad," she said, softly, sliding into the seat across from me. I don't know what to say. I studied her face, the same face Margaret once cupped in her hands when she was a child afraid of the dark. "Then don't say anything, Emily. Just listen. That's all I ask." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. For the first time in weeks, I saw the little girl I once carried on my shoulders caught between love and loyalty. Emily stayed for only a few minutes that night, but those minutes mattered more to me than I could admit. She didn't pledge allegiance, didn't make promises, but her eyes told me she remembered. Somewhere behind Richard's shadow, my daughter still carried pieces of the girl who once ran to me when thunder shook the house. The days that followed were harder. Everywhere I went, whispers seemed to follow. At the grocery store, 2 women by the produce section fell quiet when I reached for a bag of apples. At the pharmacy, the clerk spoke slowly, too carefully, as if I were a child. Even at the post office, a man I'd known for years patted my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Jacob, we'll make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. The phrase made my stomach turn. Catherine was working overtime. She called cousins in Tacoma, aunts in Spokane, even a nephew in Portland. I knew because people told me. She wanted signatures, affidavits, proof that Richard's petition wasn't just his word against mine. She smiled at them, flattered them, told them it was all for my safety. The week after Richard's petition for conservatorship reached the courthouse, I sat again in Charles's office. The same mahogany walls, the same rain tapping the window panes, but this time the weight in the room was different. Charles had a folder on his desk, thinner than the will, but sealed with the same precision. He rested his hands on it, as if steadying himself before speaking. "Jacob," he said, his voice deliberate. "There's something we didn't touch on during the reading. Margaret left a trust separate from the will. It isn't large compared to the estate, but it carries conditions." I raised an eyebrow. "Conditions?" Charles nodded, sliding the folder toward me. $2 million placed in a trust for the children. It will only be distributed if they show genuine acts of care, proof of devotion to you, not to the money. Margaret was clear she wanted their inheritance tied to their behavior, not entitlement. The word struck me harder than the sum. Margaret, always thinking ahead, had left not just money but a test. She had known what our children might become, and she had tried to tether them back to decency. When Charles explained this to the family later that afternoon, the room unraveled. Emily broke first. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She knew, she whispered. Mom knew what we were becoming. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her face. Richard exploded. "This is manipulation, a trick. She can't control us from the grave." His fists slammed the table, rattling the glasses of water Charles had set out. Catherine tugged at his arm, trying to calm him, but her own lips were tight with fury. I watched silently, my chest aching. Emily's tears cut me deeper than Richard's rage. Margaret's design was working, splintering the lies, forcing truth into the cracks. Richard rounded on me then. "You think you've won, don't you? You think this gives you the upper hand. I'll bury you in court, Dad. You'll wish you'd never set foot in this office." For the first time in weeks, I stood. My knees ached, but my voice was strong. "You mistake me, Richard. This was never about winning. It's about your mother's last wish. And if you try to trample it, I'll use every means I have to stop you." Charles glanced at me, startled at the steel in my tone. But I meant every word. I had spent too long in silence. Margaret had trusted me with her legacy, and now it was time I proved worthy of it. That night I made my first calls. An old friend connected me with a private investigator, someone who had handled elder fraud cases before. If Richard and Catherine thought they could twist the system, I'd gather proof of every step. And I reached out to Adult Protective Services, laying bare the pattern of manipulation, the whisper campaign, the petition to strip me of my rights. For years, I had let my children's tempers and ambitions pass without challenge. But not this time. Not with Margaret's name still warm on my tongue. As I hung up the phone, the church bells across town rang for evening mass, and with that sound, I made my decision. Sunday came with a gray sky and damp air, the kind of weather that settled into your bones. I dressed in my best suit, the one Margaret always said made me look taller, and walked to the church with a heaviness in my chest but a fire in my gut. The sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had spread about the will, the conservatorship, and now the trust. Neighbors, relatives, even folks I hadn't seen in years filled the pews. I felt their eyes on me as I made my way to the front, some curious, some doubtful, others simply waiting to see if the rumors were true. I felt every eye on me as I walked slowly down the aisle, cane in hand, the light from the stained glass windows spilling across the floor like fragments of fire. Reverend Paul gave me a steady nod, then stepped aside once more. The pulpit stood waiting. I cleared my throat, gripping the wood that had supported countless sermons before mine. My voice carried further than I thought possible. Last week I told you Margaret left me with a duty. Tonight I need to tell you the whole story. A hush fell heavy and expectant. For years you've heard Richard talk about success. You've seen Catherine smile beside him, polished and perfect. But what you don't know is how many times Richard came to me hat in hand begging for help. Mortgage payments he couldn't cover. Business deals that went bad. I paid them again and again, not because I was blind, but because I was a father. Gasps rippled across the room. Faces turned toward Richard, who sat rigid in the pew, Catherine's hand clutching his sleeve. And Catherine. I continued, my eyes meeting hers. You've all seen her play the dutiful wife. But behind closed doors, she whispered in Richard's ear, told him I was old, weak, ready to be pushed aside. It was her voice that turned him from desperation to greed. The sanctuary stirred. Some whispered in disbelief, others nodded, remembering moments that now made terrible sense. Emily rose from her seat, tears streaking her cheeks. Dad's telling the truth, she said, her voice trembling. I saw it. I ignored it. I let Richard convince me Mom didn't trust Dad. But she did, and I was wrong. The room erupted. Murmurs, nods, gasps. Emily's shoulders shook as she wiped her face, then turned toward me. I'm sorry, Dad. In front of everyone here, I'm sorry. I swallowed hard, the sight of her breaking open something in me I thought long dead. Before I could speak, David stood beside her. I've been quiet too long, he said, his voice steadier than hers. But I won't be anymore. I believe Dad. I stand with him. The congregation shifted like a tide. Richard shot to his feet, his face crimson. Lies, he bellowed. All of it. You people don't know the truth. He's senile. He's making this up to make me look like a monster, shouts rose from the pews. We heard the stories, Richard, one man called. We saw you borrow another woman, snapped. Reverend Paul lifted his hands, trying to calm the storm, but the voices only grew louder. Richard's own words had sunk him deeper than I ever could. I raised my hand, and the room quieted, the echoes of anger still buzzing in the air. Enough, I said. You've all heard the lies. You've heard the truth. And now it's time for me to tell you what I intend to do. I let the silence stretch, every breath in the room hanging on mine. I let the silence linger until even the restless shuffling of feet grew still. Then I drew a long breath and spoke. For too long I stayed quiet, thinking silence would keep this family whole. But silence has only fed the lies. Richard wants power. Catherine wants control. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and use Margaret's legacy as their weapon. But they were wrong. The words echoed off the walls, and I saw heads nodding in the pews. A woman in the back whispered about time, and the murmur spread like wind through tall grass. I straightened my hand, pressing firm against the pulpit. Margaret and I built what we had through sacrifice, long nights, second jobs, skip vacations. Every dollar came with sweat. It was never meant to be hoarded or squandered. It was meant to carry forward what we believed in: community, faith, and family. Richard barked out a laugh, sharp and bitter. So what, Dad? You're going to give it all away? To strangers, to people who don't even know her name. I met his eyes, steady as stone. Yes, Richard. That's exactly what I intend. Gasps filled the sanctuary. I could feel the weight of the announcement settling over them like thunder before a storm. I will be donating the majority of the estate, $20 million, to the Seattle Community Foundation. That money will go to scholarships, shelters, food banks, programs for seniors who don't have anyone left to fight for them. Margaret's name will live on not in greed, but in grace. The reaction was instant. Some applauded, others gasped, and a few shouted, "Amen." Emily broke down completely, covering her face with both hands while David reached out and pulled her into a hug. Even Reverend Paul's eyes glistened as he laid a hand over his heart. Richard, on the other hand, erupted. "You can't do this," he roared, his face red and twisted. "That money was supposed to be ours. You're a bitter old man trying to punish us." A man from the third row stood up, his voice cutting sharp. "No, Richard. He's a father who gave you more chances than you deserved, and now he's finally standing tall." Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling until the sanctuary shook with it. Richard shouted again, but his words were drowned in the roar of clapping hands and voices crying out in support. Catherine tugged at him, panic flashing across her face as she realized the tide had turned. I lifted a hand and slowly the applause died down. My voice was softer now, but every syllable carried. This was never about money. This was about whether love still means something in a family, whether respect still matters. Margaret knew it would come to this, and she trusted me to finish the fight. I will not betray her. I stepped back from the pulpit, my heart hammering in my chest. Reverend Paul took my arm, steadying me, as the congregation rose to their feet in a standing ovation. For the first time since Margaret passed, I didn't feel alone. I felt her with me here, in the voices of neighbors and friends, in the tears of my children, in the truth laid bare at last. Richard stood isolated, his shouts, silence his allies gone. The reckoning had come not in court papers or secret meetings, but right here in the house of God, where truth could no longer be hidden. The weeks that followed were like watching a storm finally break apart the clouds, scattering to reveal the damage left behind. Richard's name, once whispered with a kind of respect in our community, now carried the sour taste of scandal. The very banks that had once opened their doors to him now demanded repayment. The deals he had kept afloat with borrowed money began collapsing one after another. I read in the paper one morning, Seattle Times, the same that had reported on Margaret's will, that Richard's company had filed for bankruptcy. The headline stung, but not for the reasons people might think. I had always wanted my children to succeed, to build something on their own. Seeing his failure splashed across the front page wasn't triumph for me. It was the confirmation of what Margaret had feared, that his ambition, untethered from integrity, would be his undoing. Catherine didn't stand by him for long. The polished smile she had worn like armor slipped away as creditors circled. Whispers in town said she had taken the last of their joint savings and gone to stay with her sister in Oregon. Whether it was true or not, Richard appeared at court hearings alone, shoulders hunched, his anger shrunk to bitterness. Meanwhile, Emily came to me one evening, her hands trembling as she held out a small box. Inside were photographs, her high school graduation, our family trip to Mount Rainier, Margaret holding baby David in the hospital. She set it on my kitchen table as though laying down a confession. "I don't know how to undo everything I said," she whispered, her eyes rimmed red. "But I want to try, Dad. I want you to know I see it now. I see what we did to you." I reached across the table and took her hand, rough from years of her own work, though not as weathered as mine. "Seeing is the first step, Emily. Your mother would have wanted us to forgive where forgiveness is possible." Her tears fell freely, but this time they carried something lighter than guilt. David, on the other hand, didn't just speak. He acted. He came to the foundation meetings with me, learning how the grants were structured, how scholarships were reviewed. Where Richard had once rolled his eyes at community dinners, David now shook hands with volunteers, asked questions, and even carried boxes of food into the shelter with me. "Dad," he said one evening as we stood in the food bank's loading bay, the smell of fresh bread still warm in the air, "I don't just want to support you. I want to do this with you." Mom's vision. It deserves more than one man carrying it alone. I felt Margaret there in that moment, her hand on my shoulder, her quiet approval in the curve of David's words. The press caught wind of it soon enough. Reporters called not for scandal this time, but for stories of hope. The Miller legacy, turning fortune. Into faith, one headline read. Another showed a photo of David and me unloading canned goods, the caption praising Margaret's foresight. Television crews even came their cameras awkward in my living room. They asked me to speak about Margaret, about the will, about the trust. I told them what I always told her, that money meant little unless it built something beyond us. As the cameras clicked and the lights shone too bright for my old eyes, I thought of Richard alone in his empty house. I wondered if he watched the broadcast, if he heard the cheers of neighbors outside his window. Justice had begun to take shape, not just in the downfall of the greedy, but in the rebuilding of what mattered. The storm had passed, though its memory lingered in every corner of town. My days became quieter, more measured. I woke early not because I had to, but because old habits held fast. The air in my little backyard smelled of damp soil, and I found comfort in pulling weeds, pruning roses, and coaxing tomatoes to life. Margaret had loved this garden. I could almost hear her voice when the wind rustled the leaves. At church, I sat near the front, not to be seen, but to listen. Reverend Paul often nodded in my direction during sermons, weaving in words about dignity and forgiveness. After service, folks would gather around the folding tables, paper plates loaded with casseroles and pies. Once I would have sat quietly on the edge, but now neighbors pulled out a chair for me, eager to hear how the foundation work was going. I spoke modestly, always reminding them it was Margaret's vision, not mine alone. Emily came often, no longer with excuses or nervous glances. She helped me in the kitchen washing dishes as we talked. I used to think love was proven by success, she said one evening, her hands wet with suds. Now I know it's proven by sacrifice. She looked at me then, and for the first time in years, I saw no distance in her eyes, only a daughter finding her way back. David had become my shadow in the work with the foundation. Where once he was unsure, now he carried himself with purpose. He visited schools, spoke to students about scholarships, and met with city officials about food distribution. Sometimes he brought his own children to the community dinners, and I would watch them laugh with other kids, their voices high and free. That sight gave me a peace I hadn't known in a long time. Richard, however, became a ghost in his own life. People said he was living in a small rented apartment on the edge of town, the fine suits and polished shoes replaced by worn jackets. Catherine had not returned, and no one seemed to know where he spent his days. When his name was spoken at potlucks or in the aisles of the supermarket, it was with a shake of the head. Such a shame, they'd say. Greed took everything from him. I didn't gloat when I heard it. I only felt the weight of what Margaret and I had tried to teach, that money could vanish, but honor was harder to steal. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. Children played on the street, neighbors waved as they watered their lawns. My world had grown smaller, but also clearer. Peace didn't come from the size of a bank account, but from the way people looked at you when you passed them by. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.